right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. And on today's episode, we've actually got a special treat. I think you guys are going to love this one because this guest is a different guest than what we normally have on the show, but I think a perfect guest for Church Disrupted and for the Spiritual Abuse Institute. In this conversation, we're going to be talking with Lori Morrison. Lori is an author of multiple books. One, I believe, is In God We Trust is the title, In God We Trust, but everyone else we background check. She's a podcaster of the Unlovely Truth Podcast, and she's a private investigator. So a lot of different places that this conversation can and will go. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. But Lori, welcome to the podcast. We're so glad to have you on today.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. I'm really excited to be here because I love what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I think I've been looking forward to this conversation because I think it's going to be a lot of fun. As we get started, I try to give you the best intro that I could, but you're in a lot of things. You do a lot of things. Why don't you catch our listeners up and introduce them to you and kind of what you're doing and why you're doing this work?
Sure. I actually just retired my private investigator license. I had done that for several years, and I really felt God calling me to take what I had learned there, take what I had learned years and years ago when I was on a church staff. I've worked as a paralegal for a large denominational entity. And so it was just all these things together. And I wasn't quite sure how they all worked together until I started working on my church's security team, volunteering, and just really felt like there's so much we need to talk about that isn't getting talked about in too many places. And so I've tried to focus on not just personal safety, which is my first couple of books, but safety in our churches, because you know as well as I do that most churches overestimate how well they are caring for the holistic safety of the people that they're ministering to.
That's right.
So so I tweaked my podcast a little bit to be, true crime and faith as it applied to kind of the broader community, because really all the same crimes are going on in our churches. And so I wanted to make sure people were aware of that, not giving up hope, not despairing, but learning how we can deal with things and how we should deal with things if we want to shepherd our little flocks, whoever we are responsible for, in a way that the Bible calls us to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, that's one of the best pictures that we have of pastoral ministry is a shepherd taking care of the sheep. Yet today, it seems like in a lot of places, we've gotten that kind of flipped, that we think our job is to go out and find sheep and buy sheep and get them in the sheep pen and have the biggest sheep pen instead of just caring for the sheep that are in our pen. You know, Jesus, when he was talking to Peter at his restoration, he would say, "Peter, do you love me?" And every time Peter said, "Yes, Lord, I love you," his response was, "Then feed my sheep, then take care of my sheep." So, and too often, as someone who's been on church staff as well, too often we don't ask that question. We ask, how can we grow? We ask, how can we get in more tithe money? We ask, how can we retain more people? How can we, mobilize more volunteers? And it is very often to go weeks and months and sometimes years without ever really asking, are we caring best for the sheep? How do we care best for the sheep? So, and at the end of the day, I think whether we get as church staff, whether we get a well done, good and faithful servant is going to be completely determined on how well we cared for the sheep that Jesus gave us. Not the ones that we talked into coming to our church, but the ones that Jesus gave us to care for. So, so countercultural. But I didn't know that you ever worked in the church world or on church staff. So, I think I've always got a unique perspective because of being someone who's been through spiritual abuse, worked on mega church staff, small church staffs, church consulting, business owner. I think all those worlds colliding makes me have a unique vantage point that helps with this work. Sure. Sounds like for you, that's been the case too. You've got, you're a podcaster, you've got the PI license that you just retired. Yet you've worked in the church world at the same time. I can imagine that working in the church world with a private investigator's license, that you were probably asking questions that most people weren't asking. Let's talk about that. What are some of those questions you were asking that were probably foreign to everybody in church world?
Yeah, and those questions were not always real well received, I will say. But
I'm sure.
I was asking questions like, have we thought through potential unintended consequences of this particular policy? Are we looking at liability? Are we setting ourselves up to be doing things we shouldn't be doing, where we could get our staff in trouble? We could get, nobody wants to think about lawsuits, but they happen. Religious entities, churches,
Yeah.
all kinds of organizations, they get sued. And so you have to protect your people from being caught up and having their lives, really damaged in that way. You have
Yeah.
to think about your insurance. And these are all, boring, non exciting things that people want to talk about in the church world. But you know what? One of the quickest ways to destroy every ministry you have is to become uninsurable by the way you conduct yourself in those ministries. I have
Yeah.
seen that happen. And so
Yeah.
those are the kind of things I was always throwing out there. And one of the duties that I had was talking, we did some camps. And so we were talking about, how should we be conducting ourselves at these camps to protect the kids and to protect
Mm-hmm.
our ministry. And I would ask people, and I'll put you on the spot, I'll make you guess as well. And this
Yeah.
is a slightly dated statistic, but I don't believe it's probably changed too much. So if you're talking about pedophiles, who of course are
Mm-hmm.
going to want to show up at camps because that's where their intended
Yeah.
victims are, how many times do you think they offend before they're actually caught and possibly have to face some consequences?
Honestly, being a longtime youth pastor and trying to vet people as well as I could because of that, I would say it's probably 7 or 8.
Way higher. It's
Higher.
117.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat that. It's
I thought 7 or 8
117
was
offenses.
high.
And then
117
typically the
offenses
response
before
I
they're
get.
caught? Oh
Mhm.
my goodness.
And I do suspect that they are caught way before that, but people don't want to say anything.
Or it's
I don't
covered
want to
up.
ruin his ministry or her, but I'm going to say his because typically, statistically, it's overwhelmingly males that offend in this
Mm.
area. And I always wonder, why are we putting the offender's needs before the victims? Because this is not
Mm.
something that you just get over. This is something that has lifelong consequences for people who have suffered this kind of action against them.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not trying to be shocking or provocative. That's reality. And when
Yeah.
people say, well, I want to see the best in someone, I just want to say, but don't you want to see the truth about
Yeah.
someone?
I want to see the best in the best people. I don't want to see the best in people who are hurting people. So sometimes people will accuse us of that, Lori. They'll accuse us at Church Disrupted of being, hey, you're just trying to, you're just going for clickbait. You're trying to be shocking. You're trying to be provocative. You're just trying to get clicks. When the truth is, no, we're sharing the truth. We're talking about things that people don't often want to talk about. The
Right.
truth is shocking at this point. The truth is
Mhm.
provocative at this point because we've let so much sin grow in the darkness. There's no way for
Yes.
us to talk about it without it being shocking or provocative. But if we don't talk about it, from my perspective, that doesn't help the church. That only means we're going to have more scandals. We're going to have more cover-ups. And not only does
Yes.
that mean that more people are getting hurt, which is the most important thing, but
Mhm.
2, people are going to trust the church less if we keep having these
Yes.
scandals and cover-ups. And for me, as bad as, like sexual abuse is, spiritual abuse is in a lot of ways just as damaging. It's different in how it damages you,
Right.
but it's so damaging that psychological experts are talking about putting religious trauma and religious trauma PTSD as its own diagnosis in the next DSM because it affects us at a
Nice.
soul level.
That's
Yet when it
nice
comes to
because
things like, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's important because it will drive not only resources to the people that need it, but it will drive conversations that I hope will
Yeah.
make people reevaluate. When I tell people I'm on my church's security team, all people think about is physical safety. And I
Mm-hmm.
say, no, we need to be looking at physical, emotional, and spiritual safety. We have to be caring for the entire person.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
And a
that
lot of
gets
times,
overlooked.
Oh, it definitely gets overlooked because it's easiest to cover up spiritual abuse because people will say things like, what even is spiritual abuse? Or that's just a woke idea. That's a new idea. And I was talking to a pastor about it earlier. I said, it's not so much a new idea, but we had to put language to it because it's become such a common thing. It
Yes.
used to be much more uncommon. Okay. Now it's become common. It's become baked into a lot of church DNA. So we've got to be really intentional to make sure that we're not spiritually abusing people, especially because a large majority of spiritual abuse starts out accidental. It's not
Yes.
intentional. It's simply pastors and church leaders not knowing what it is, not knowing how the things that we say and do actually affect people. But with both sides of that, if we're not trained, if we're not paying attention, then there it doesn't matter how many people are in the room, doesn't matter how many people are attending, doesn't matter what the budget looks like. There becomes this line of broken and bloodied people
Oh,
behind us out the back door. That's not what we want the church to be known for. So I want to think about this, and this could really go for all different kinds of abuse. But the difference with spiritual abuse and all the other kinds of abuse is most abuse, if it's not spiritual or mental, if it's physical or sexual, well, reporting that is very clear. We report to the authorities. Okay. And I'm just going to tell you, if you're going through that, okay, or you suspect that someone is going through those things, that is criminal. Call the police. Don't be scared to call the
yes.
police. Okay. We don't need to
Yes.
involve pastors first, because if someone on a church staff is doing something criminal, they've removed the right to Matthew 18 or anything like that. It's not a spiritual issue, it's a criminal issue. Okay. We have
Right.
laws. When it comes to something like spiritual abuse, though, there's not a law for that. People don't know who to report to. So a lot of times, what ends up happening is we have to actually report to the very people who are abusing us. And there's all
Yes.
kinds of spiritual language and scriptures that are twisted to that. So it makes it very hard for people to report.
Mhm.
When you're talking to churches or you're talking to spiritual abuse victims, how would you recommend that churches um, how would you recommend that churches have spiritual abuse reported? What's the safest way to do that and to provide a reporting structure where people feel safe, they feel like they can be honest, and it's least likely to be covered up? Because we know a lot of those things are covered up in order to protect the church's reputation, or in order to protect the man or woman of God, or to not be divisive. And of course, we'll talk about that stuff later. But if you were going to lay out a roadmap for churches, what would you recommend as far as spiritual abuse reporting?
I think it depends on the resources that the churches have. If you can, I would reach out to, maybe it's a denominational leadership if you're in that kind of structure. There are different organizations that will do this for any denomination, where you can call like a 1-800 number and you can report to this third party. Like we say here in the South, they don't have a dog in that hunt. And so you can feel like you're going to be heard and they're going to be more objective. Um, Now,
That's
sometimes
one
at
of
the
the things we're going to be
denominational
doing with
level,
SAI as well. So
oh,
that's coming
perfect.
with the Spiritual Abuse Institute, is a way for
Yes.
people to report, hey, here's abuse, here's what happened, what do I do next? And whether it's us or another mediator, bringing a
Yes.
mediator into the process for that reporting.
Well, and I tell people that I work with, this is what I did when my daughters were teenagers. I said, just blame everything on me. If you're worried about, just say, I talked to this outside consultant and she said, and then it's
Yeah.
not you. And I'll make phone calls to churches and talk to them. I'm happy to do that, because at the end of the day, that person may or may not still have to maintain a relationship with people in that culture. I
Yeah.
don't have to. So I can be objective, I can be honest, I can tell hard truths. But same thing as you're saying with your company, doing that, going higher up the food chain in your denomination, although I will say hasn't worked really well for the Southern Baptists. No offense to anybody that's in that denomination. There are great people in that denomination, but their reporting structure leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah.
Um, I love how you talked about going to the police for things other than spiritual abuse, since that should be a crime. It isn't. Too
Yeah.
many churches, I hear them say, well, we want to check it out and see if it's credible. That's not your job. And I
Hmm.
will also say that you're not qualified. You're not equipped. You don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
I've conducted interviews on witnesses, on suspects that didn't know I was considering them a suspect. And there's an art and a science to getting information out of people. And that's not taught at seminary.
No.
So it really bothers me when churches say, well, we'll take care of this because we know how to. Well, more than likely you don't know how to. So you need to reach out to someone like Jeff or someone like me who does know how to. Like we talked about at the very beginning, one of the biggest jobs we have is caring for our people. Just like Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I think there's some truth to that in how our churches are supposed to work too. The church is there to glorify God and serve people. It's not there to be served.
Well, and a lot of churches have that twisted, because if you go to, we talked about this on previous podcasts, but if you go to the average church and you listen to their announcements, you're going to hear a lot about how you can give and how you can serve. And if you really start taking apart those announcements week after week, it becomes very narcissistic, because sometimes we forget we're there to serve people. We think people need to serve us because what we do is as parishioners and church staff, we've equated in the modern church serving the church systems as serving God. And they're often not the same thing. They can be the same thing,
right?
But they're not always the same thing. I can serve inside the church so much that it's at the detriment of serving God, who wants me to go out and fulfill the Great Commission, who wants me to love on people in my community. You think about the early church. When the early church was facing its greatest persecution, one of the reasons why the church wouldn't die was, you can look back at different historians who have said this. No matter what you believe about the church, one thing is for sure: when there's a crisis, they're the first ones in and the last ones out. They are the real deal. They're taking care of people. You go back to even the plague, when the government and everybody else was moving away, it was the Christians who were going in and caring for people. Yet now, a lot of times we've lost that kind of reputation with outsiders, because so much of what we're doing to serve God is inside the walls of the church, where outsiders aren't. We're serving each other, and it becomes a little bit more of a country club mentality. Hey, Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association, and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. I want to think about a couple of things. Like you talked about abuse being reported and churches saying, we want to look into that. We want to see if it has any validity. And I want to talk about the difference between internal and independent investigations, because that's something that is very, very important to us, right? You can have an internal investigation, and sometimes it doesn't even make it to an investigation. Church leaders that say, hey, we're looking to see if there's any credibility in this, and we just didn't find that the accusation was credible. They don't even do an investigation. Other times they'll do a months-long investigation, weeks-long investigation, but it's done internally. And, going back to what you said about not knowing how to ask those questions, I remember starting as a student pastor at a large mega church where we have, over 500 students a night, over probably 1,000 students every single month. And we would, because of the volume of students, we would often get reports of abuse at home, or it could be physical, it could be sexual, all of those sort of things. And one of the things that we realized very quickly, we always had police officers on site. If we get a report of that, we, one, have to report it. And I taught
Right.
all of my volunteers, there is no way you don't report it. I said, even if it's me, if it was my kids making an accusation and you say, there's no way Jeff could do that, you report it. Okay.
Yep.
Because if it's not credible, it's going to, that's going to be very clear, but we have to report it. So when we started reporting it, the police officers we always had on site for safety, that we would pay to have on site for safety, one of the early things they taught me and our other volunteers is, okay, well, when that involves a minor, you report it, you put them in a room, you're there to love on them, but you don't ask them any questions. You don't ask them any questions till we get a professional to ask them questions, because there's certain questions that you don't ask of a minor. There's certain questions that you don't ask of an abuse victim. There's ways that we can actually mess up the investigation if we ask the wrong questions. So that's another reason why internal investigations bother me, is we don't know if we're asking the right questions, and the people who are investigating, whether it's pastors, elder boards, denomination, doesn't matter, they're always people with spiritual and moral authority over that person. It's very intimidating for them to be the people who ask those questions. So the church world normal response is, we're going to investigate this internally. I love organizations like Grace, Godly Response to Abusive Christian Environments. I love organizations like that come alongside and say, hey, we're for the truth. We're not on the side of the victim. We're not on the side, or of the allegations. We're on the side of the church. We're on the side of the truth, and hopefully reconciliation if that's possible. But if not, justice, if justice is needed. So when you think about this from a PI perspective, what are the differences you see between internal and independent investigations, and how would you recommend churches make a shift in that area? Why would you make those recommendations? So let's just talk about that, because I think internal versus independent investigations is one of the biggest problems we have today in the church world.
Oh, I would definitely agree with that. And, if you've watched any kind of courtroom drama, whether it's on TV or movies, one of the things that somebody is always saying is, hey, that person has a conflict of interest, and that means they should be excluded. Well, if you're trying to do an internal investigation involving your own people on both sides of the equation, you've got a conflict. You cannot possibly hope to be objective.
Especially if your board consists of your family members and your closest friends.
Yes, which in a lot of churches do. I spoke with one person who said in their church they had a deacon or an elder, I can't remember which, but their son had been accused of some wrongdoing. And they said, but don't worry, we didn't, let him be involved in any of the discussions on this. And I said, and that's a great first step. But the next step that needed to happen was he needed to be put on a sabbatical. It's not his fault, even if everything that was alleged is true, not his fault. That's his son. But you can't let your congregation even think that there's bias. So, if somebody says, well, he wasn't in on the discussion, but he's sitting there, it's being talked about in front of him, that just looks like he potentially could be influencing something. So you just have to
even
very
if it's
lovingly...
just the father, the pastor who's in those discussions, you can't separate, that's my son, I'm going to want to protect my son. That's natural human instinct. So, and then again, if the rest of the elder boards and deacons are good friends of him, and they're doing life together and they believe in each other, there's so many reasons to disbelieve a victim, because, well, I know that family, I know that person, they're good people, that was just a mistake. There's all of these lies and reasonings and twistings that we buy into that they don't happen with an independent investigator, because they don't have all of that stuff to untangle.
Right. And experienced investigators understand that people are not the sum total of the worst thing they've ever done. So they can sit there and be nice to talk to. They can be charming. They can have good qualities. That does not mean they did not do what they were accused of. Kind of an extreme example, but Ted Bundy volunteered on a suicide prevention hotline. A very nice thing, a very good thing to do. That did not make him a good and nice person overall. That did not absolve him of the other things that he did. So we have to be able to separate what we think of as a good, nice, God-fearing person, we all have the capacity for evil, and we don't like to admit that. That's hard to admit, because if that charming person is, then I am too. Then other people in my life that might hurt me are too. And so,
Yeah.
as kind of a self preservation tactic, we just deny that good people, church people, can ever do bad things.
Well,
So,
even David, King David was a man after God's own heart. You know, there's
right.
so much that we model after King David. Christ came in the line of King David. Yet,
Yeah.
probably King David's greatest mistake was what happened with Bathsheba and having her husband murdered, right?
Right.
Now, that was against the law, but there was no one to appeal it to for a king. Um, but God didn't let it go. That didn't change the fact of what God said about David. It didn't change David's call. It didn't change that he finished his life as a man after God's own heart. But God did punish him. God did bring consequence, right? And he
And
had to
that's
deal
something
with
we
that.
skip a lot.
Yes.
We equate forgiveness with restoration, and they're not the same thing. People can
Yeah.
be restored in their relationship with God, but that doesn't mean we restore a pedophile to working in children's ministry. Even if he's forgiven, even if he's repentant, even if he's completely changed, you cannot take that chance. You just
Yeah.
can't. And I've seen too
Yeah.
many times when churches want to show how Christian they are by putting people in harm's way to be able to say, look how we forgave and restored this person. You know, when
Mm.
Moses was leading the Israelites through the wilderness and they were grumbling about the water, and God said, well, speak to the rock. Instead of speaking to it, he smacked it. And then he said, do I have to do everything for you instead of giving the glory to God? He was not allowed to enter the promised land. So, like you said, there have to be consequences. There have to be.
Well, no, none of it. We don't like to receive consequences. We don't like to give consequences, especially if it affects the bottom line. And a lot
Mm.
of times, the people who are doing the abuse are very good for the bottom line of a church. They're
Yes.
gifted individuals. There's a reason why they're able to get by with these things or cover these things up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when we look at it, there's so many things that we miss with those
Mm-hmm.
internal investigations, right? You know, we don't tend to ask the right questions. We don't think about the consequences. Talking about restoration, yes, every person can be restored. There is no sin we can commit that is so great that God can't forgive us. There's nothing that we can do that is so bad that we can't be restored. There is a big difference, though, between being restored as a person and being restored to
Yes.
a position. The number one qualification that we have for an overseer in Scripture, number one, without fail, he must be above reproach. Okay.
Right.
And above reproach doesn't mean that no one brings reproach. It means that when they bring reproach, it doesn't stand. You know, so like the example I always use is someone says, you know, hey, well, here's my reproach for Jeff. I think he's cheating on his wife. Well, that's not going to stand because I have so many rules in place with my wife that if someone says, no, Jeff's cheating on his wife and here's when he was doing it, I can show you exactly where I was at. She has my location. I can look back at my calendar. We can look back at all these things. I can show you exactly what was going on. And all of those things are there because I know I'm capable of doing things I don't want to do. I'm capable of sinning against my wife. I'm capable of hurting people, right? So we can, to be above reproach doesn't mean that no one ever brings an allegation. It means those allegations are quickly quashed because the truth comes out, right? So the moment a person's not above reproach, they're disqualified from ministry. Whether they can be restored or not, I think it depends on the nature of the sin, but also the nature of repentance, Lori, because we
Of
forget
course.
about this. And this is something I'd love to hear your thoughts on too. We're still talking about the independent investigations, but one of the kind of the research pieces I'm doing right now, I don't know when the video is going to come out, but we're doing research for what is biblical forgiveness, because there's a lot of
Mm.
churches that teach, yes, that person hurt you. Yes, that person may have been spiritually abusive, but we forgive. We've got to forgive. And they'll use the scripture. If we don't forgive our brother, then God won't forgive us, right? But they miss
Right.
the scripture where Jesus said, if your brother sins against you, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him, right? We miss the fact that there are two different words in the New Testament for forgiveness. And one is the forgiveness that is unconditional from God. The other is the forgiveness that is conditional on repentance, right? So we forget that Jesus died for all sin on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
He offers forgiveness to all people, yet in any part of the Christian faith tradition, we realize there's some sort of repentance and acknowledgement that is needed, belief, repentance, and acknowledgement that is needed to receive that forgiveness. So forgiveness
Right.
doesn't always mean restoration, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't mean that we sweep under the rug what happened or stop talking about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a justice component that's involved in that.
Well, and going back to an independent investigation, that is so important because we don't sweep things under the rug because we don't have anything to gain from that. People that sweep things under the rugs are doing it to protect someone, to avoid conflict or pain or whatever. Those aren't considerations for independent investigators. And so that's one reason why that is so very important. Another reason is that we're not burdened with cultural assumptions. You know, every church has its own culture. And if we're not a part of that culture, that's not going to bog us down. We're not going to realize that, well, you can't say that to that person. You can't ask that question in here. We're not going to know that. And even if we've been told that, we're going to ignore it if necessary to get to the truth. Because like you said before, it really all comes back to the truth. And independent investigators are just so much better equipped to be able to get to that than internal ones are for just a myriad of reasons. And I think that we're afraid of, well, we'll hurt our reputation if outsiders know what's happened here. Trust me, your community knows. If you've got somebody in your youth ministry that's too friendly, inappropriate, even if it's not to a criminal stage yet, everybody knows that. They just do. And you pretending that it's not there, it's not real, that actually damages your credibility more than if you would name it and face it and deal with it. Because how is anybody going to believe us when we say we understand what it takes to be eternally secure when we can't even keep you secure in the here and now?
Yeah, for sure.
So you're damaging your witness. That is my biggest point that I try to get people to understand when you're talking about church security, whether that's physical, emotional, or spiritual, or I hope all of them. If you're not doing the best you can in those areas, you are limiting your ability to effectively share the gospel.
Yeah. And a lot of times we say the opposite. We say when we're going after truth, we're being divisive, we're being hurtful, we're hurting the witness of the church. When what is hurting the witness of the church a lot more is, covering those things up. So I'll tell you one of the things that we're going to do with the Spiritual Abuse Institute, the nonprofit that houses Church Disrupted. One of the things that we're doing is we're doing what we call church safe assessments. We're finishing up the processes for those right now. We're working with churches that say, hey, we want to be a safe place. We want to have a safe, trained staff. We want to be a place that if you've been through spiritual abuse, you can connect and know that even though we may not agree on everything theologically, and even though we're not perfect, you can know that this is a safe place with safe systems so that you can re-engage without fear of being hurt and having it covered up again, right? And part of what we're going to do in that process is one of the things we look for is a red flag or a green flag of reporting. Okay. And I wanted to run some of those things by you and just get your opinions on them because, right here, and that's what I love about Church Disrupted, we can talk about work that we're doing, ask for expert opinions. And hey, if we're wrong and we need to backtrack on something, everybody gets to be a part of it. Right.
Nice.
But one of the things that we're working on with reporting is we're making recommendations to churches that to be healthiest, one, you decide on your reporting structure and publish it before there's ever anything to report. Here's how you report, who you report to, who knows, and then how it gets to the church. Okay. The other thing that we ask them to do, we ask them to decide in advance who their third party reporting mechanism is going to be. Okay.
Yes.
It can be us at SAI. It could be grace. It could be a mediator that they have on retainer that has nothing to do with the church. Usually we ask if that's the case that they're in a different city, even if it's, an hour away where they could still drive in, or whether it's, a long way away. But
And they're
if you have
highly
a place like
trained.
that,
They're
yes,
highly trained. They're not Cousin Bob.
exactly. So if you have a reporting system up front, it may look like this for a church, and it could look different for different churches. But a church may say, okay, here's our reporting structure. If you have any sort of spiritual abuse allegations that you're not sure of, you don't think they're criminal, or it could be sin or scandal or worry, if you have a concern in those arenas, here's how you report. You contact this number, you send an email to this place, and here's who is going to contact you back. It's a third-party mediator that is not a part of our church, and they are not allowed to contact us until they have contacted you and heard from you. If you want them to report to us afterwards, you make sure you have someone walk you through that, then they're going to report to our church board, not our pastor, but our church board, whoever the accountability structure is. And that gives us an opportunity, Lori, if they don't have a church board or an effective church board, we can put one in place. But the mediator then contacts the church board and says, hey, we've got this allegation. We need to set up a time to hear your story, to hear their story. And then if need be, we'll get people in the room or in separate rooms together so that we can protect the victim, and we can try to find some fact finding here. The goal there for us that we try to lead people to is churches, when you have that, it keeps you above reproach. No one can say that you didn't listen because you had a third-party mediator who has no connections to your church other than this contract, and they're just on a retainer so that people can call them when that happens. Then they come on site, and their goal is one of two things. It's either reconciliation, if that can be done, okay? And we've still got, every time I think I've got the settings figured out on Apple, we've still got those. So I think we're going to have balloons for forever and likes and all that. It just makes the podcast fun.
I'm glad you saw those too. I was worried about myself.
It always throws me off. Our listeners have a lot of fun with it right now because we can't figure out how to get it turned off for good because the way it comes back. But the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to look for, hey, sometimes these allegations aren't really spiritual abuse. They're disagreements. Sometimes they're spiritual abuse, but it's light. And when the pastor finds out, they go, I didn't mean it that way. What can I do to make it right? Reconciliation is often on the table, especially the earlier we report these things. Okay. Most pastors I know, the earlier it's reported, there's a great chance reconciliation can happen, and they'll make this right in a way that the victim feels comfortable with. Okay. The longer things go without being taken care of, the greater chance permanent damage is going to be done. Okay. But if they can't reconcile, if they cannot reconcile and say, we have come to a good resolution with this mediator, okay, then the mediator's next response is, okay, if we don't have reconciliation, then we immediately trigger an independent investigation. And that's what we ask churches to do, is you've not only decided in advance about how you report and who you report to, you've not only decided in advance about the mediator you're using, but you've decided in advance which group or groups that you would call in what order when the mediator triggers an independent investigation. And they know they have a policy. This is who I call in this order. We find out who will take it, whether it's Grace or someone else, and then they come in and do that independent investigation. Once the independent investigation is done, they get with the mediator with the results, they share it with the board, and then the board has already decided. Once they share it with us, we don't decide what we share with the church and whether we share it with the church. Once they share it with us first, so we can have a plan, to deal with it once people know, then they share it to the church. Having all those plans laid out up front keeps us from getting into trouble, makes sure that we pursue truth. And while we will offer things from SAI like the mediation, we'll tell people we can offer the mediation and be that third party. We won't do the investigation because that's not our skill set. We can mediate, we can trigger the investigation, but we'll give you recommendations for who can actually do the investigation. So as you hear about that, that's kind of the holistic type of process we're trying to build with church-safe churches. What do you think? Does that sound like it's on the right track? Are we missing something? What else might churches be missing? And if you think it's on the right track, how do you think this will help churches?
Well, I definitely think you're on the right track. I would only add one thing. You talked about communicating what has happened to your congregation. I would think about getting some outside help with that too, because I've seen so many situations where churches have had a situation, they've communicated, and they've done so extremely poorly. And that can
Yes.
easily undo all the positive things that an
Hmm.
independent investigation has done. Um, Using phrases like, so and so has had a moral failure. What does that even mean? Did that person gamble away their family's life savings and now they're destitute?
Hmm.
That's a whole lot different than them perhaps committing a criminal act. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that you have to give everybody every detail about what you know, but don't be ambiguous.
Hmm.
Don't. Another one that just blew my mind, they led with, here at the church, we are so grieved, we are hurting, we are blah, 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 blah. Oh, and by the way, this happened.
Mm.
Don't lead with you. Don't lead with
Yeah.
how hurt you are. Don't lead with what a wonderful job you're doing dealing with this. It's
Mm.
not about you, church. I know that's really
Yeah.
hard for church leaders to grasp and appreciate, but it is about the the victim. It is about, even though this kind of turns our stomach a little bit depending on the circumstances, it's about the offender. That's a person that needs to be reconciled with God. And so you focus on the victim. If the offender is repentant, you I wouldn't suggest counseling them yourself. I would help
Yeah.
arrange, again, somebody independent. But when you're communicating things, get some outside opinions. I'd be happy to look at some things and go, wow, yeah, you don't want
Hmm.
to say it this way, because you made a great point earlier. A lot of times when something spiritually abusive happens, it's inadvertent. It is somebody not being careful with their words, not being
Yeah.
mindful of what they've said. And that could so easily be avoided by just getting a little bit of input from somebody that's a little bit removed, that doesn't have the emotional attachment.
Yeah. And if I could add, and you tell me if I'm off, because I think that's a great ad, that we got to think about. One of my, it doesn't need to be a marketing firm. Let's just say that. It doesn't need to be a marketing firm or people who are professional communicators that help you communicate that message. And I say that as someone who teaches communication. I have a communication business, right?
Mhm.
But a communication firm, a marketing firm, they're going to spin what happened. And that is
Right.
the last thing that we need. We don't need any spin. People need as much of the pure, unadulterated truth as we can give them. So, our
Mhm.
recommendation in that process, and I think this is something that we got to make very clear, because it was easy for me to talk about that and miss it. But our recommendation in that process is whoever did the independent investigation, they talk to the board.
Mhm.
Once the board calls the church together, though, they'd say, "Hey, here's what happened. Here's the allegation. We brought in this independent firm to do this. Here's their report. They're going to give us their report." They give the report, and it's not being cleaned up. It just says the report, and then hopefully they could be the ones to coach the leadership on, here's what you say versus don't say. Yes,
Mhm.
it's okay to be grieved, but you're not grieved that it happened. You're grieved that person was hurt.
Yes.
You're grieved that they were sinned against and had to go that. You're grieved that, your brother or sister that was the offender, you're grieved that happened, that they got to that
Mhm.
place. You're grieved for where they're at, right? So having those independent investigators, I feel like a lot of times they do, because they're in a role like have
Right.
been, right? I'm thinking about people like, Boss Savigian. They're going to
Mhm.
have a very good way of saying, hey, here's what you can say to not hurt people any worse, but also not to spin it. Because a lot of times, too often, when churches think about hiring someone to help us communicate something, it's all about spinning it so we get the least amount of blowback. And I'm just at a place where I believe the church would be better off if we would receive the blowback that is due with humility instead of trying to
Amen.
spin it, because people don't want to be lied to.
And people are getting more savvy. I can tell
Yes.
if it's spin, and most people can too. They may not say it to your face, but um, there's always going to be that thought in their head, What did you not tell me? And be upfront about that. Say there are privacy concerns, there are potentially legal concerns. And so there are some things that we're just not going to be able to be candid about at this point. Just tell
Yeah.
people that. People can understand that. But don't tiptoe around and use tired old phrases like they had a moral failure or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and sadly, we tend to make we tend to make it out like there's a lot more legal issues we have to sidestep and privacy issues than there are. Because a lot of times in sin
Sometimes.
cases like that, there's not a ton of privacy issues, right? Because people on church staffs, they know, and usually it's in employee handbooks and everything else. There are certain things that you do, you're going to be terminated for it, right?
I'm thinking more about
And
if you got minors involved, you never,
yes,
ever, ever,
absolutely.
ever, ever, ever identify that minor. If you have criminal allegations, you make sure you phrase them as allegations if you feel the need to
Yeah.
address them very specifically. Um, if you fire someone, say that you fired them. Don't talk
Yes.
about how they've moved on to new opportunities or
God
whatever.
called them to a new role. They're transitioning to
Yes,
their next opportunity. People know that's a lie.
they do. And then again, you're harming your ability to share the gospel truth with them when they've already heard lies coming from your mouth.
Well, and I would tell you, it's easy for us to believe, even when we know it doesn't sit right with us in our gut. It's easy to believe our pastors and our leaders because that's comfortable, right? So I'm
Mhm.
just going to say this. If you're listening and your church has turned over a lot of staff while you've been at that church, and everyone who left was called to a better opportunity, or they transitioned off staff and it was a good thing, then somebody's lying. People
Mhm.
get fired, and more often than not, they're getting fired. And if we don't tell people that, it actually steals from the person who is grieving that process. Because,
Mhm.
hey, just because you get fired doesn't mean you're a bad person, doesn't mean there was a moral failure or anything like that. The more ambiguous we are, um, then one, it takes away from that person having people grieve with them, people
Mhm.
support them. But two, it allows people, Lori, to ask a lot of questions of, again, instead of knowing what happened, which may be bad, people fill in the gaps on their own. And when people
Mhm.
fill in the gaps on their own, they can take it anywhere. So,
Yes.
I've known of many pastor friends who have had, a church say, hey, we just, they were called to, another place, or God's calling them the next season or something like that. And they felt like they had to come out and say, no, I was let go, but it wasn't because of a moral failure, because people were assuming. The more vague we are, the more we let people assume, and people's imaginations run wild. We're better off just telling the truth, owning it, and moving on.
And I would say too, this is kind of a bold and spicy statement, which might upset some people, but so be it. I think that we can become complicit in that person victimizing other people when
Mm,
we try to cover up what they did in our ministry or our
yeah.
church. We've seen that happen so many times, again, with the SBC, with the Catholic Church, and not just them, they just happen to be in the news the most about that sort of stuff.
Hmm.
But when you're just passed along to, like you said, your next season of ministry or whatever, then the people hiring them just assume, oh, everything's fine.
Yeah.
And I know churches worry about, well, that person will sue me if I give them a bad recommendation, but you can find the words to let those people know. And churches that are hiring, call references.
Hmm.
Don't just assume that, oh, I ran a criminal background check, this person checked out fine. Well, again, we talked about pedophiles offending 117 times on average before they're caught. So call people that know them and really
Yeah.
find out about that person. Character is so much more important than titles.
Hmm.
Whatever job that person had, whatever accolades they've had, check their character.
Yeah.
Because the way we act is a form of communication as much as it
Yeah.
is words. We can try to hide things, we can try to put on these fake personas, but we leak out who we are in what we do. And so if you
Yeah.
talk to the right people, if you watch for the right things, you can find these things out. It just always drives me crazy when people say, oh, well, this just came out of nowhere. We had no idea. And then they'll end up going, well, there was this, and this. I'm like, yeah, you got to look for those things. And when you see them, act on them.
Well, and a lot of times, this happens in both the church world and the business world.
Mm-hmm.
People aren't calling references as much anymore. I know as a business consultant, they're not calling references because everyone's giving them a fake reference because they're scared of getting sued. And I always go back to this with churches, with people leaving churches. There's always fear around, defamation and slander and libel. And the one thing I always remind people of is, hey, with all of those things, we can get so scared of the law. Here's the one thing the law always allows for. The greatest defense against any of those things is simply the truth.
Yes.
If you're telling the documented truth, you don't have to worry about anybody suing you and it getting past point A, right? It's just not going to get there. So again, and that's why it's important for churches to document when you're firing someone. If it's for a moral issue and that's in your employee handbook, it's a moral issue. If it's for, a job performance, document where you tried to correct the job performance, what happened. People are making these decisions for themselves. But again, we get so worried about sometimes in the church laws and everything else that we forget. It doesn't matter whether it is morality, whether it's our Christian walk, or whether it's the law. The truth is the highest value we can hold to. And the best way to protect ourselves is simply to tell the truth. Now, there's times where we don't offer up information that's not needed, but we have to tell the truth about the information that is needed. Spiritual abuse is terrible because it causes trauma that can linger for a lifetime. And the pain that comes with spiritual abuse, that's the kind of pain that a person can feel deep into their soul. At the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we want to stop spiritual abuse through awareness, education, research, and practical resources. You see, at SAI, we're fighting for a future where spiritual abuse is rare and really hard to hide. But we can't do this without your help. As a donor-funded nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our community for everything that we do. So, if you've been blessed or encouraged by this podcast in any way, would you consider giving a donation of any kind? Because by partnering with SAI financially, you are giving a voice to the voiceless. You're going to help more people heal from the devastating effects of spiritual abuse, and you're going to help us to challenge more churches to create safe and healthy environments for everyone. You can give a donation by clicking on the link in the description below or by visiting spiritualabuse.institute. Every gift counts, and we are hyper grateful for every donor and every supporter of this community. And hey, in May and June, we're looking specifically for 100 people who would commit to giving $1 a day to support SAI. By giving as little as $1 a day, you'll help us reach our budget for the rest of the year, and you're going to help us to get more content out, to help more people heal, and to do work with more churches who want to start doing things the right way. So if you've been impacted in any way by this content, or the Church Disrupted podcast, would you consider joining the 100 for 1 campaign and becoming a financial supporter of SAI? Thank you so much for your consideration. And guys, thank you. Thank you to every single person who has already partnered with us financially. Together, we can end spiritual abuse and we can help the church become a place of hope and healing for everyone again. A lot of church leaders, they subscribe to, and a lot of people in the church, not just church leaders, they subscribe to the idea that talking about spiritual abuse or talking about scandal or talking about sin, that those things are divisive and they hurt the church and they hurt the bride and they hurt Christ's reputation. And we talked about this just a little bit earlier, but I would actually say it's more divisive to not talk about those things. That it hurts the bride of Christ and the church's reputation more to not talk about those things. So we are very quick as church people to talk about unity and not causing division within the body. Yet at the same time, we're very slow to remember that Scripture says a lot about justice as well. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that we maintain unity is through justice. So you do a lot of work with justice. You have a heart for justice. What are some of the things that you see through Scripture about the importance of justice in these issues and worrying about justice as much, if not more, than we're worried about division or protecting our reputations.
Well, I mean, one of the first things that pops to mind is Micah 6:8. What does your God require of you to do I know I will not quote this right. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God.
Mm-hmm.
So that right there, God wants three things out of us. And justice is one of them. I think God is a God of justice because he's a God of love. He is love. He embodies love. And, think about your own children. You love them so much and you want everything to be right in their world.
Mm.
If something goes wrong, someone hurts them, you want to make that right. Well, God's looking at any victim of any kind of injustice the same way. He wants that to be made right. Now, we have free will, and so sometimes we're able to, for a season, keep it from being made right. But Scripture also says that all of our secrets are going to be brought to light. Everything's going to be out in the open for everyone to see. So, we're working at odds with God when we're trying to cover things up. And you look at the Old Testament, spoke about talking about these things being divisive. Look at the prophets. That's pretty much all they did. Yeah. We mentioned David, and Nathan came in and told him this elaborate story, this teaching example. Mm-hmm. And David's heart was just, that's not just, that's not right. He goes, but I'm talking about you, David.
Mm.
So how are we going to be convicted to the point where we repent if nobody talks about these things? Because again, I don't think it's enough just to sit back and go, I'm not the one that did that. Well, okay, but are you a part of a church that refused to have written policies and procedures in place to make sure these things didn't happen? You might not have been the hand that struck the blow, but did you do anything to prevent it from happening? And of course, we can't prevent everything. But I think that we are called, again, back to the idea of us being shepherds. I think sometimes people think that that's just the senior pastor, but it's not. It's anybody that's overseeing anybody. Yeah. So if you're a second grade teacher and you've got your little Sunday school class, that's your flock. I'll tell a story real quick. You and I spoke about how I was actually on a church staff a long time ago. And my little flock was the children. And we had a man show up at church one day, and I recognized him as my sixth grade teacher who had been allowed to move on to his next season in life rather than be fired after he tried to one of my classmates. Everybody knew he had weird little ways of dealing with the girls in his classes. I experienced it to a very, very minor degree. Everybody knew, but it was covered up. And so here he comes to my church. And after he leaves, I go into my boss, my senior pastor, and I said, okay, I know this guy's background. I know what he's done. I also know that he likes to go around. He's got ponies and horses, and he likes to go around to churches and say, hey, I'd love to come to your VBS or your family fun day or whatever and do this wonderful thing for the kids. And I said, if that's what he was here asking about, absolutely not. We can't do that. And he kind of sat back and he said, well, Lori, God can forgive anything. And I said, yeah, he can. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Talking about preventing him from doing anything else he needs forgiven for. And he said, well, it really sounds like you're the one with the problem here. So I realized
that was blame shifting and gaslighting all in one sentence.
Yes. And we look for that as investigators, by the way, which I wasn't at that point. But
well, once you see it, you can see right through a manipulator. Oh, yeah. But until you've learned to see it, it puts you on your heels. And because most people aren't trained to recognize gaslighting and blame shifting and deflection, they don't recognize it for too long. And Lori, that's the church scandal response playbook. Yes. Let's deflect. Let's blame shift. Let's minimize. Let's gaslight.
I didn't have the words for it yet, but he made me mad. So I just looked at him and said, okay, do what you want to do, but I will tell you this. If he shows up at VBS or any kind of family event or anything where we have the children there, I said, I will personally tell every family in this church what he is, what he's done, and that you knew and you let him come anyway. So, needless to say, I did not get Employee of the Month that month or any month ever after that.
You're lucky you stayed on staff with the comfort, but we need more staff members. And we have so many church staff members, Lori, who listen, and they're in places and they're trying to navigate. Do I stay and try to make a change, or do I leave? Because a lot of our senior pastors, they're not realizing your staff sees it and they are tired of it. There's a whole generation of church staff. They are tired of these shenanigans. So I know we got a lot of people in our audience who listen, who are on church staffs. And that is the fear. 9 times out of 10, you're going to lose your job when you say something like that. And 10 times out of 10, it is worth it. Because there's a point where we have to decide, do I stand up for what's right? And do I protect people? Or do I become complicit in the sin? Because I'm going to be the one that needs forgiveness for being a part of this sin if I don't say something when I know something's wrong. So as scary as it is, and we are in your corner in any way that we can be. And guys, I say this as a church staff member who ruined my career, asking the wrong questions, who left ministry because the questions weren't welcome. Okay. Yeah. I get it. But we've got to start asking these questions, because if we don't on church staff when we see something wrong, who else is going to? We've got to stand up for what is right. And the term of senior pastor should mean senior servant. And if they are not using it as senior servant, they're using it as senior, I'm in charge and it's my way or the highway, they're already disqualified from ministry. So we might as well call it out.
And for the record, I did lose my job, but he was a very intelligent man and he knew that he needed to bide his time. And so eventually he put out to the congregation the notion that my role had always been temporary and it was time to move on to the next phase of how we were improving the ministry. And thank you so much, Lori, for everything you did. And I confronted our elders and I said, was this job ever meant to be temporary when you hired me? And they just kind of went, no.
Yeah.
So elders, stand up. You're the ones that are supposed to be in charge. And I actually had a lady come up to me and say, I know there's more to this story, but I don't want to know what it is. No, you do want to know. I hate
those responses.
You do want to know. You need to know.
Well, and that's if you're a parishioner and there's stuff that's happening and it doesn't seem to make sense, or when someone does bring something, if we keep turning a blind eye to it because it's uncomfortable, then as parishioners, we become complicit in the same sin, and God will hold us accountable for the same sin. So, Lori, I don't talk about my story a ton anymore on the podcast. I don't know how much that you know, but essentially, my wife about a little over a year ago, got presented with an NDA. We said we were not going to sign the NDA because it doesn't belong in churches. And the moment she decided not to sign the NDA, it was, you don't get to work out, with your clients. You don't get to do any of that. Now, all of a sudden, we're going to take you out right now, and we're going to escort you out with people holding your boxes like you're a common criminal because you refused to sign a silencing document. So we tried to talk to the pastor involved. We tried to talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it. So before the smear campaign or the spun story started with us, we simply said, hey, here's what happened. We're really sad. Candace got fired. It was unexpected. It's sad. Pray for everybody involved. By the way, here's the NDA they asked us to sign, and we refused. So if anybody tries to tell you anything else is going on, let's just come talk to us, right? We didn't want to do that to hurt anybody, but we knew what was about to happen. Thousands of people found out about that NDA and still go to that church without any repentance from the leadership because it's comfortable. And they'll tell us things like, oh man, we know it was bad. We know they shouldn't have done that, but there's always a but. There's multiple people who I've talked to who know from this same church that people have left staff. And hey, I know just what you said. I know there's more to it, but I don't really want to ask. Because we don't ask about things like that, that's how we get to things like NDAs and hush money being used. And then the next step is worse, and the next step is worse. And that's how we get to these deep places of sin and these deep places of scandal. If you are a staff member or parishioner, it doesn't matter. If you're part of a church and you don't ask the questions you know need to be asked, if you don't press when you know something's wrong in your gut, we become complicit in that sin. And we become complicit in that sin every single time. So I just want to encourage people who are listening. And Lori, I think you'd be, in the same place. If you see something, don't be scared to say something and stand up and get a little uncomfortable, because the people that we're not speaking up for, I promise they've been more uncomfortable. And if
Right.
we don't say something, it's just going to continue.
And don't sign NDAs. Please don't sign NDAs.
Ever.
I've been part of a Christian organization where that was routine for people if they left the company. Like you said, non-disparagement, non-disclosure. Again, NDAs originally were crafted to keep trade secrets secret. And
That's right.
they're great for that, and that's necessary and all that good stuff. They were not meant to silence allegations of misconduct, whether that rises to the level of anything criminal or not. There's a lot of things that aren't criminal that are still just flat out wrong. And Hillsong is embroiled in a very, very similar thing. And I'm not, I know people like their music. I'm not trying to dog on them, but they had a student at their university in Australia sue a staff member and a lay worship leader, same person, he had dual roles, for basically groping her extremely inappropriately. The church tried to pass it off as a hug gone wrong. I mean, I've had some awkward hugs, but nobody's ever lifted my shirt and tried to kiss my stomach, as she alleged he did. They also tried to say, well, people are making this more than it actually was because they want to hurt the church. So again, they're trying to silence people. First, they minimize, oh, it was just a hug gone wrong. Then they blame shift. Oh, it's really everybody that's trying to hurt the church, and you don't want to be someone that's trying to hurt the church, do you? And so there was a civil lawsuit that involved this all, and the parties reached a settlement. But when the woman who had been assaulted got there to sign the settlement, there was an NDA presented to her. And she said, you will not take my voice, and refused to sign it, refused to settle. I don't know what's happened since that. That's very
recent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she said, so that was, and she's in the news. We don't use public names unless they're public record, but she's in the news standing up for this. It's Anna Crenshaw, and she's an absolute hero.
Yeah.
When that story came out, we posted it on our story on Church Disrupted and said, this is a hero. We need more people to do this. And one of the things that she said was roughly, hey, people already knew Hillsong's use of NDAs already came out in some documentaries and stuff.
Yeah.
She thought now that had been exposed and Brian Houston had left and leadership had changed, that hopefully things had changed. They could get this settled and Hillsong would do better. And I think that's what threw her for the loop. No, they're still giving NDAs now. We'll admit we did something wrong in the settlement. We don't want people to know it, right? And that's the problem. We become more concerned with our reputation. So churches say this, Lori, churches say, if you talk about the bad things that happen, if you bring allegations, you're divisive and you're hurting the church's reputation, so therefore you're hurting the reputation of Jesus. I would say it's the complete opposite.
Yes.
I would say that when we try to keep people quiet about those things and we don't own up to the sin in our own lives, in our own organizations, and when we don't try to love people the way that Jesus has called us to love them, when we try to hide those things, we are harming the reputation of the church. And we are giving people a different reputation of Jesus because we're hiding it. So if anybody's harming the reputation of Jesus, it's churches trying to hide bad things for the sake of making the church look good.
Right. We should be the safest place in our communities for people to come when they're hurting. And study after study, you look at it, whether it's a Gallup poll or whether it's Lifeway research or whether it's this guy that I really like. I can't think of his name right now. But anyway, they all say that not only is church attendance declining, church membership declining, but the number of people who say they have a great deal of trust in their local pastors and churches is declining.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a self-inflicted wound. We've
Hmm.
done that to ourselves when we try to cover up, when we try to pretend that we're perfect, when everybody
Yeah.
knows that we're not. We've completely given up on the biblical practice of lamenting. God, have mercy on me. I have done wrong.
Yeah. Scott McKnight talks a lot about that in
Yep.
his work.
So I think we need to stop trying to be media sensations. We need to stop trying
Mm.
to idolize our worship music or the number of books our pastor sold. Not that there's anything wrong with pastors selling books, but when that becomes the thing we're known for, instead of, wow, I went to that church, they saw me, they heard me, they met me where I was, and they helped raise me up. That's what we should want to be known for. And we've lost
Yeah.
sight of that, especially in the Western church.
Well, and one of the things it's so sad, we talk about division like it's the worst thing that could happen to the church. And yes, Jesus did call us to unity.
Mhm.
Jesus taught about unity. Jesus prayed that we would be unified. All of that is true. We've lost the ability to say, though, that two things can be true at the same time,
Mhm.
that this can be true and this can be true. And the truth is, yes, Jesus did call us to unity, and people will recognize that unity, right, as really a part of the fruit of us following Jesus. At the same time, it's true that Jesus was divisive.
Mhm.
Literally, if you read when Jesus said, do you think I've come to bring peace on earth? No, I've come to divide and pit mother against father and brother against, brother.
Yeah.
When he talked about that, the headline of that passage in most Bibles is Jesus came to cause division, to bring
Mhm.
division, right? We look at Jesus with the Pharisees, the same Jesus who taught Matthew 18, which is, hey, how do we handle disagreements with a brother, right?
Right.
That same Jesus didn't use Matthew 18 with the Pharisees because they were religious leaders in public sin that was hurting people. It wasn't just two peers, it was publicly religious leaders hurting people. And Jesus, in a very divisive way, I think we would call it today, rebuked them in public multiple times.
Yeah.
Most people read the story of the widow's mite and they think the widow's mite is a story of sacrificial giving. When if you take out all of the headings and verses, you realize it's the same passage. It's following up Jesus rebuking the Pharisees for devouring widows' houses. It's literally a rebuke and then a picture of the rebuke. And we forget that rebuke happened loudly and publicly in the court of women in the temple. It was the one place where almost everyone could go. It was
Yeah.
the most public shaming that Jesus could give them, right? We look at Paul. When Paul opposed Peter in public, that seems very divisive the way that we talk about it, right?
Mhm.
When Paul wrote letters when Paul wrote the letter to the Corinthians and saying, "Hey, you need to remove this person." When Paul wrote about his disagreements with Barnabas, right? All of those things were not just a letter to those churches; they would be circulated throughout the churches, and now they're scripture. They're very public
Yeah.
rebukes. We would call that divisive, yet Jesus did it. Paul did it. We watch person after person do this. And then even Jesus to John in the book of Revelation, writing 7 letters, most of those letters to churches that were public, that any unbeliever can read today,
Mhm.
they were rebukes. And we'll say, you don't want to be divisive. You don't want to hurt the reputation of the church. And if we talk about these things, unbelievers are going to see. What are they going to think? Well, those letters to the 7 churches are still read by unbelievers today.
Mhm.
Those letters that Paul penned are read by unbelievers. There's much for the unbeliever as for the Christ follower. So
Right.
when we talk about division and protecting the unity of the church, that is great. We can't do it at the expense of what Jesus taught us
Mhm.
and what Paul taught us and what the Bible teaches us about justice. And I also think about this, Lori. People struggle to think of Jesus as the one that often rebuked the religious leaders publicly. We
Yes.
struggle to think that he could ever be divisive because we've decided that all division is sin when it's just division that is uncalled for
Right.
that is a sin. But think about the famous verse that we hear used all the time. You were on a church staff, you're a Christian, you've heard this many times, where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am there among them. We love that verse. And it makes us feel like when we gather, there's a power and Jesus is with us. And this is the power of the gathering. That wasn't the context at all. The context of Jesus saying that was talking about Matthew 18 and talking about correcting a brother, even if it meant taking him before the assembly at the end of the day and saying publicly, I'm washing my hands of this person. And he said, where two or more are gathered together and agree in my name, I am there with you. Which means if we have two or more witnesses who are saying there's a problem with this leader,
Right.
Jesus is there with us, and Jesus is saying, yes, this is okay. I'm here with you, which means that sometimes what the church calls division, Jesus is actually behind. We have to get a holistic view of unity versus division and of rebuke and justice with forgiveness. If we don't look at the scripture as a whole, we will only be one-sided and we will hurt people. Jesus never intended for us to be so unified and so forgiving that we let heinous sin and crime go.
Yeah, I love a meme that's going around here recently that says, if he were alive today, meaning Paul, said, we'd be getting a letter.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. Where there's no accountability, there's no growth. Where there's no accountability, there's no safety. And that kind of brings us back to what we were talking about, whether it's keeping people safe from spiritual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And that's kind of a nebulous one that people are like, well, what is that? What does that one even mean?
Hey, Disruptors, have you heard about the Church Disrupted community? It's an online community for Church Disrupted listeners where you can ask questions. You can connect and talk with other like-minded people who've experienced church hurt and spiritual abuse, and you can ask honest and vulnerable questions without judgment of any kind. And that's without the trolls, the anger, and the constant arguments that tend to come with social media. And the best part is it's 100% free because of our gracious and generous donors. So, if you've experienced church hurt, spiritual abuse, or religious trauma of any kind, and you're on the healing journey, I want to invite you to join me in the Church Disrupted community. You can join at disrupted.church or spiritualabuse.institute. And we're also including a link below where you can join just through the description. So, what are you waiting for? Join the Church Disrupted community for free today. We can't wait to meet you.
And I'll tell you a quick story. My husband and I left a church, and we were having some issues anyway. We didn't just flake out because of this one thing. It was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But the pastor was, and this was a big church, and I'm pretty sure that the staff met to go over, what was going to be preached and everything. So I don't believe this was an off-the-cuff remark that just wasn't well thought out. But the pastor was preaching on sexual purity. That's great. That's biblical. And he was clumsily trying to explain that, people don't do things for no reason. We're trying to fill a need, but we're doing it in a way that God never intended. And so he said, women that are having sex outside of marriage or before marriage, and I'm thinking, women? There's usually somebody else there with her. It'd be nice if you'd mention the guys, but okay. And he said, they're getting something out of it, whether it's love, just a feeling of affirmation. He said, like prostitutes get money. And I just sat back and I thought, every woman in here who's made a choice that she may regret, every woman in here who may have been forced into something she didn't want, you just called her a whore. That may not have been your intention, but I'm telling you, that's what a lot of people are hearing. And I leaned over to my husband and I said, I won't embarrass you by stomping up the aisle and slamming the door on my way out as I would like to. I said, but I'll never set foot in this church again. And they compounded that mistake. We let them know, because we'd been there a long time. We let them know we would not be attending anymore, and told them why. And they said, we'd really like to talk this through with you. I said, okay, I'm willing to do that. But I will talk to any other pastor but the one that delivered that. because it's not the first time he's done something like that. And I need someone who will actually listen. And they said, okay, fine. It'll be this person. Great. Time for our appointment comes and they're like, oh, we had something come up. Can we reschedule? Okay. Life happens. I get it. When you've done that for the third time, you're telling me you don't care. You absolutely do not care about how we felt about this, how it impacted us. And you're just going to go on with business as usual.
Yeah, well, and it was one of those things we had to actually reschedule this podcast the first time, because I was
stuff
sick and not
happens.
feeling well. Yes, and I had to make sure this was one thing I had to protect today because I've already canceled on you once, right? So
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't see that. We even hear a lot about pastors. Today we hear a lot about pastors who say, I can only meet with you for 15 minutes. You have to call my assistant. It's 8 weeks out. I can only meet with you for 15 minutes, and only if you tithe enough. And when we get to that point, that's not really someone pastoring us. That's not someone pastoring a church. I wanted to mention one thing that you said in your book, and I think that's a great way to land the plane. And then I want you to be able to tell people how they can connect with your work, your podcast, your books, because you're doing great work and we need more people who are doing work like this out there. But in your book, In God We Trust, Everyone Else We Background Check, you said red flags and things that people do or say, they're not exceptions to their true character. They're the experience of their true character. And when I read that, I thought that hit the nail on the head. We overlook so many things we see in churches as exceptions when oftentimes it's a church telling us who they are. And that's why we look for, in our assessments, red flags and green flags, because churches are telling us who they are. And if they want to change those things when confronted or not, lets us know who they want to be. So when a person's looking at those potential red flags and they're just not sure about their church or they're not sure about a leader, what advice would you give them?
I think I would get a trusted friend and discuss it with them. Make sure they understand that it's between the two of you, but try to validate. Am I the only one seeing this? Am I somehow being, because of some experience I've had, am I being hypersensitive to something that's not meant in the way that I'm filtering it? Because we too, we make assumptions about people's motivations for how they're acting. So you just want to make sure that you're seeing it as it is. And if you've been validated, and if people say, and they don't have to say, yes, I experienced that too. They just have to be able to say, I don't think you're off base with that. Then if you're comfortable doing this, I would try to find somebody on the leadership team that you can talk with, because it may be that person says, you're the second person, third person, whatever, that said that. We didn't see it, but now we've heard it and we want to make it right. Most of us are pretty bad at self-assessment. That's why we have coaches and that's why we have mentors and things like that. And so it may be something that they just weren't aware, that they were doing, or even if they knew they were doing it, they might not have known the impact it was having. So give them the benefit of the doubt, give them the opportunity to improve. But if it's just something extremely egregious, they're completely in denial. And I don't give this advice lightly, but I would say it's time to look for another faith community to worship with. Life's tough. You don't need to have your faith community making it worse for you. When you ask about the red flags, are they a welcoming church? I went on a little stealth visit to a church where I had interviewed for a position on staff, and I was getting ready to be offered it pending, approval of some board. And so I thought, I'm going to come visit and I'm not going to tell them I'm coming. And of course, this was back before we could see each other on Zoom calls and different things. They didn't know what I looked like. No one greeted me. No one spoke to me. I stood right by the area that said visitor, and I'm looking at all the brochures. I'm trying to make it so obvious that I'm new here. No one spoke to me, my husband, my children. Wow. And so I called him the next day and I said, I'm going to withdraw my name from consideration for this position, and here's why. And he felt so bad, and he said, that's not our church. And I thought, but it was for me. You don't always get a second chance.
It's not who you want to be, but it's who you were.
Yeah. So look for things like that. Look for things like, if I bring up a problem, am I listened to or am I dismissed?
Yeah.
Am I told that it's not a big deal, or things like that? Look to see if, I hate to sound like high school, but are there cliques? I remember being new at a church one time, and I volunteered to help with some children's ministry stuff, and I had been a children's pastor. So I knew what I was doing, and I was told, "Oh, we've got enough volunteers." Wrong answer. You never have enough volunteers. I would make up jobs for people because they're not just asking to serve, they're asking to join a community.
And the more that you have, the less likely you are to overstep their boundaries and burn out the ones that you have.
Right. So just, does this church feel like a place that's going to help you reach your God-given potential, use your God-given gifts? Or is it a church that wants to know what you can do for them? If you ever get that vibe, run. If you can't fix it, run.
Yeah. We had a whole episode, talking about narcissistic systems in the church and the narcissistic church. And it's from that vibe that they talk much more about what you can do for them and for God by extension than how they're serving you and how they're equipping you. So anyway, Lori, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fantastic conversation. As our listeners, if they want to connect more with you or they want to get your books, what's the best way for them to follow with your work?
I have a website. You can go there, theunlovelytruth.com. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, The Unlovely Truth, Instagram, The Unlovely Truth Podcast. You can find me on LinkedIn. Go to Amazon. Don't type my name in. There's another Lori Morrison author, and she writes a lot of really new age stuff. So if you see something like that, that's not me.
Yeah, that's not you. Don't get confused. That's a totally different book.
But, type in God We Trust, Everybody Else Gets a Background Check book. And then you can find my author page so you can see what else I've put out there. And I offer a free 20-minute phone call consultation to any ministry leader. You don't have to be on the board or the senior pastor or anything like that. Any ministry leader that wants to talk about some potential safety issues that they're dealing with. And
that's awesome.
I will give free training to churches that will help me put on an event and bring other churches in to talk about these issues. So I'd love to talk about anybody that might be interested in either of those things.
As we're doing our church safe assessments, if anything comes up with physical safety and kids and everything else, then that you're going to be one of the people that we recommend to them, because we do a lot of the training on the spiritual abuse side. We can't do the training on the physical side, but we know when we see that it's not right. So we're going to keep you in mind. We highly recommend, if you're a church leader,
thank you,
you need help in those areas, reach out to Lori. Fantastic resource. And Lori, thank you again so much for today's conversation. Super life-giving. We may have to have you back on the podcast again at some point, because I've got a whole page of questions I never made it to. So that's the mark of a good interview. I got a page of questions I didn't make it to, that I might just have to ask you to come back on again. But thank you for your time. Thank you for the work that you do. And thank you for your heart for churches. It's a great reminder that we can push on things. We can call for justice. We can call for the church to be at its best and still deeply, deeply love the church. So I'm so grateful for that example. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Follow up with Lori on her website if you want to get those books, if you want to check that out. It's an incredible resource. But we're grateful that you joined us today, and we're always grateful for your support of Church Disrupted and the Spiritual Abuse Institute. Until next time, grace and peace. We'll see you on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast.